That's one of the great, largely forgotten stories of this era, is that in Moscow, Khrushchev accepted the idea to do a joint mission.
Welcome to Cold War Conversations.
We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other thing, not because they are easy, but because they are hard.
Just down this road, the South Vietnamese forces regrouped once again, and were trying to fight off the advancing North Vietnamese.
Okay, all flight controllers, go for landing. Retro, go. Fido, go. Guidance, go. Control, go. Telcom, go. GNC, go. Ecom, go. Surgeon, go. Capcom, we're go for landing.
In a world divided by the ideological struggles of the Cold War, the Vietnam War and the Civil Rights Movement, more than 1/5 of the people on the planet paused to watch the live transmission of the Apollo 11 mission. To watch as humanity took a giant leap forward exactly 50 years ago today. Now, before we start, a special thanks to our select band of supporters who are helping us financially for the price of a cup of coffee a month to cover our increasing costs and keep us on the air. They are the proud owners of a Cold War Conversations coaster, this year's a must-have household accessory. Head over to patreon.com/Cold War Pod for more information. That's patreon.com/Cold War Pod. You can also help us by leaving reviews on iTunes or where you found this podcast. It really helps us get new guests on the show. Today we speak with Robert Stone, an Oscar and Emmy-nominated documentary filmmaker, and Alan Andre, co-authors of the book Chasing the Moon, companion book to the landmark documentary series, which will be showing on BBC TV, PBS and other channels around the world. We welcome Robert Stone and Alan Andre to Cold War Conversations. What are the origins of the US space program?
The origins of the American space program essentially came out of the Cold War with the concern about nuclear proliferation. In fact, President Eisenhower's interest in orbiting a satellite in 1955, it was announced as being part of the International Geophysical Year as a scientific exploration of the environment in outer space. But in fact, his real concerns were about surveillance and establishing overflight so that the Soviet missile program could be monitored. And that became the reason why Eisenhower was reluctant to be the first nation to orbit a satellite. Because he was afraid that it would cause an international incident, because overflight, going in orbit over a country and looking down on them, was a violation of airspace.
Right. And the origins of this technology date back to World War II and the V2 missile attacks on London. Is that correct?
It was Werner von Braun's project, working as Hitler's munitions genius, essentially recruited by the German army in 1932, that essentially led to the creation of what we know as the ballistic missile, which was the V2, which went into operation in late 1944.
Yeah, so what happened was von Braun came to the United States and started building intercontinental ballistic missiles for the U.S. Army. The Soviets got a certain number of lower-level German rocket engineers to come back to the Soviet Union, and they were developing their own ICBM, also based on the V2. But what happened was the Soviets were calculating the size of the warhead that they were going to have to that this rocket was going to have to carry, and they calculated we have to lift about 6 tons The Americans calculated would have to lift about 3 tons because the Americans were better at miniaturization on their warhead designs. And so the Soviets ended up with this massive rocket that was way bigger than the Americans had developed. And it was so expensive and so complex that it wasn't really useful as a weapon, but it allowed them to launch things into orbit before the United States. And so they had this massive rocket that they ended up using for Sputnik, and then seeing the worldwide reaction to that, which came as a bit of a shock to them, they proceeded with these space spectaculars, one after another, that were the United States just was not able to match in those early years.
So Eisenhower, with his sort of like, didn't want to launch a satellite because of the potential of an international incident. The Soviets obviously didn't take a similar view. But I'm surprised to hear that they were surprised by the international reaction to that. Did they think there would be criticism of them launching a satellite then?
Well, they didn't think that the American public was going to go, and the American political leadership were going to go into a complete panic, and it was going to make headlines all over the world. That was kind of a surprise to them. Yeah, it was a scientific satellite as part of the International Geophysical Year. It was certainly a great achievement, but they didn't expect that it was just going to cause this complete kind of psychic breakdown in the West.
Yeah.
that oh my God, the Soviets are the leading technological society, and we've fallen behind. So that was a surprise, and Khrushchev was pleasantly surprised, but it wasn't something he had predicted. He wasn't actually that interested in the whole project until he saw the panic in the West. Then he said, "Oh, okay, this is interesting. Let's do some more of this." So a month later, they launched a dog, and 3 years later, they're launching the first man into space. So.
Yeah. And so Yuri Gagarin is this first man in space, and again he takes this massive publicity tour around the world, and again that must have been a shock because the Americans appear to be on the back foot.
Right, and in fact, President Kennedy, up until Gagarin's flight, he really hadn't even thought about space exploration, human space exploration, that much. During the campaign with Nixon, he was emphasizing the missile gap, quote unquote, between the United States and the Soviet Union, blaming the Republicans for being sort of asleep at the wheel while the Russians got the bigger, heavy lifting rockets, which were actually a result of many years earlier. But by the time he becomes president, he's really not concerned the first couple of months about space exploration that much at all. In fact, appointing the head of NASA, James Webb, was one of the last cabinet appointments he made.
Right.
But then Gagarin goes up.
Yeah. Because I think I read somewhere he was more interested in some desalination project than the space program.
Yeah, he thought that the key technological thing, was that. So he said the most important thing advanced technologically that human beings could do at that particular point in history was desalination.
But then he comes around to the American space program becoming a great PR tool.
Well, the one thing we have to put in there is 1 week after Gagarin is the day of Pigs invasion, or maybe it's even less, or maybe it's 5 days after Gagarin goes up. He does the ill-fated CIA-backed invasion of Cuba, which goes badly. And so he's already a new president in his first 100 days. He's had 2 big setbacks. So he's looking for something to bolster his image, but also to show a command that he's in charge. So.
Yeah, so he's casting about for how can we beat the Russians, and his advisors is saying, well, we really can't beat the Russians. They're way ahead of us with rocket development, as I said earlier. They're going to continue to do these space spectaculars for quite some time. It's going to take a while to catch up. And it was Wernher von Braun, who dreamed since he was a kid of sending rockets to the moon, who said, well, let's just move the goalposts. Let's just set an entirely new objective beyond orbiting the Earth. Let's go to the moon, because if we go to the moon, the Russians don't have a rocket that'll get to the moon, and we don't have a rocket till they get to the moon. So it'll sort of press a reset on the whole race. And von Braun was convinced that he had the ability to build a rocket that would go to the moon, and the Russians probably didn't. And he was right, as it turned out. But that was when Kennedy said, "Oh, well, okay, well, let's go to the moon."
But that was quite a big, a massive gamble. And I think I read in the book that JFK sees this as also an opportunity to show the superiority of the capitalist world over Soviet technology.
Sure, that was. Yeah. I mean, that was ultimately the whole premise of the entire thing for them and for the Russians too, which was to say, our society is the leading the cutting edge of the future. We're the wave of the future. We're sending humanity to the stars. Come with us. To the developing world, which was just coming out of colonialism and was deciding which path they would take. Would they go to the liberal democratic West or the communist East? And so the space program was a way of demonstrating that the best of what the Soviet society could achieve and the best of what American society could achieve. And it was kind of a war of visual imagery, really.
Yeah.
War. It was a propaganda war. Yeah.
Yeah. And he makes that iconic speech where, we choose to, I can't remember the exact words, but, reach for the moon or go for the moon.
Not because it is easy, but because it is hard. Yes.
Right. I was hoping somebody would remember what the what the rest of the line was.
I was going to say, you can cut in the audio there.
We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard. Because that goal will serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and skills. Because that challenge is one that we're willing to accept, one we are unwilling to postpone, and one we intend to win, and the others too.
And I think an interesting side story is the story of Ed Dwight, which he's this black US Air Force pilot who is introduced into the astronaut school. And was this an attempt at showing equality or just a PR stunt?
Well, it has an interesting origin. We go back to Edward R. Murrow, who was the CBS journalist for years, who covered the Blitz and took on Joe McCarthy in the 1950s. He left CBS in 1961 to become Kennedy's head of the U.S. Information Agency, which was it was a government agency promoting the image of the United States around the world. And he was the one who suggested that because of the American perception in the emerging third world, the African colonial countries, the former colonial countries, Latin America and Asia, and because of the stories coming out of the American South about the civil rights movement, that if the United States recruited a black astronaut, they could use that image around the world to sort of counter the negative images coming out of the American South. And in fact, Murrow at one point says, for all purposes, he would be the most important astronaut because he would be a person of color, which we have to acknowledge most of the world is. It's kind of an interesting little memo that he sends off. And nothing happens for a while, but then they start by 1962, the Air Force starts going through files, and they find Ed Dwight, who has an engineering degree and does have time as a pilot, airtime. And then so they ask him whether he would like to be recruited to go to Edwards Air Force Base and to train as a test pilot and then go through their astronaut program. He goes through the test pilot school, and he goes through the astronaut school, and he applies to be a astronaut for what would be the third group in 1963, but he is not chosen. But the interesting thing is that at that time, even before the decision was made for who would be the astronauts for the third group in '63, he was already on the cover of a number of magazines. There were images of him. He even becomes part of a comedy routine by Dick Gregory, the black comedian. I mean, the news is out there in the press while he's even being trained. So.
But it's also a reflection of the difference in perspective that NASA had on what they were doing and what the Kennedy administration had on what they were doing. The Kennedy administration's purpose with the space race is exactly what we've been talking about: is projecting American technological prowess and American prestige around the world, whereas NASA saw it as purely in sort of engineering terms, like, well, okay, we're going to send men to the moon and we're going to go there. They never even considered like taking cameras into space or television cameras, or, it was just a mission to accomplish this goal. They're a bunch of engineers. So they saw no benefit in having a black astronaut. It didn't factor into their thinking at all. In fact, they were resentful of it. Whereas the people who were looking at this from a more PR perspective and seeing the sort of bigger picture, saw the benefit of integrating the astronaut corps early on.
Yeah. So do you think he was turned down because some people felt he was getting too much publicity? And
yeah, there was a lot of resentment. There's a lot of resentment that, that he was somehow being treated special because of his race.
I think one of the things that I was really surprised to read that I had no knowledge about was that JFK tried to reach out to Khrushchev for a joint lunar mission.
Yeah, that's one of the great, largely forgotten stories of this era, is that Kennedy was appalled at the spiraling costs of the program almost from day one, and the duplication of effort. And within 6 weeks of giving his first speech announcing that we're going to put a man on the moon by the end of the decade, he goes and meets with Khrushchev in Vienna, his one and only meeting with Khrushchev, and proposes, doing a joint mission. And Khrushchev thinks about it, but turns him down because he's afraid that doing a joint mission with the Americans will reveal to the American military that they only have a few ICBMs. They've only got a few missiles. The whole missile gap was kind of a bluff, and that the Americans would get too much of an inside knowledge of their technological position with rockets. But Kennedy, after the Cuban Missile Crisis, Kennedy and Khrushchev were both very interested in winding down the tensions of the Cold War and finding areas of cooperation. And Kennedy proposed this again in a big speech at the United Nations in September 1963. And apparently, according to Khrushchev's son, in late October, early November 1963, through back channels to the American embassy in Moscow, Khrushchev accepted the idea to do a joint mission.
Wow.
And of course, Kennedy's killed on November 22nd, and Khrushchev was overthrown in October 64. And the whole idea just died. But it's a fascinating what if. I mean, the whole history of the Cold War would have, I think, been thoroughly transformed if they'd pulled this off.
Yeah, somebody's got to write an alternative history there.
Yeah, but it was widely publicized. I mean, there was a big spread in Life magazine about how they do it with diagrams, and yeah, it was a big deal at the time. But it's been forgotten because it never came to pass.
Fascinating. When Kennedy makes that call, they have to start the Apollo program from scratch. I mean, they've got some ideas, but they don't have the technology.
Correct. They didn't have the technology. The interesting thing was they actually had a plan that was being written in 1960 about the Apollo program, but it was all speculative on paper. They didn't know how it would be done, but they were just saying they were thinking about this in the background. It was sort of a fantasy. Well, what if we were, became this big agency? But nothing. I don't think they ever thought it was going to happen within, a couple of decades. And then Kennedy makes the call, and they can pull the paper out and say, well, wait a minute, what can we do here? So, but even Robert Gilruth, who was the head of manned spaceflight at the time of Kennedy's May 25th, 61 speech, said he was kind of shocked when Kennedy chose to do that, because he said, I don't even know how we're going to do it. So.
Apollo 1 is the supposed to be the first mission, but that's the first indication that things are being rushed too quickly and things aren't being tested properly.
Yeah, well, the Apollo 1 mission was scheduled to launch in February of 1967. And between the last Mercury flight in 1963, there was the Gemini program, which was sort of a continuing story of gradual progress as each mission built on the others, and they learned to do things like spacewalks, rendezvous and docking, a lot of observation, a lot of maneuvering. And that's what they built upon to get to begin the Apollo program. And the Apollo program was beginning within 2-3 months of the last Gemini flight in November of '66. And that's, as you say, that's when the rush, the problems with the rush of getting the Apollo program going came to fruition with the accident in January of '67, the fatal fire.
Yeah. And also at that time, there's a space treaty signed as well.
Correct. It was actually the same day as the Apollo 1 fire. In fact, the space treaty, the Outer Space Treaty, was signed an hour before the fire in the White House. And it was jointly signed, I think, in the White House and in Moscow and in, was it London? I can't remember. Somewhere in Europe. The three different locations they signed it that day.
And what did that cover, that treaty?
It essentially, it was for the first and foremost thing was to reduce any arms in space. No orbiting nuclear warheads, no combat spacecraft, but also it ruled out sovereignty of claiming the moon as the sovereign property of another nation, that kind of thing. And it's the basis of almost all space law since then.
And so the Americans are working on the Apollo program. What are the Soviets doing at this point?
Well, the leader of the Soviet space program, Korolev, who was sort of the von Braun of Russia, died in 1966, and that was a huge setback for them. Although Korolev had only been really given the full go-ahead with full funding for a moon mission in 1964, late 1964, after Khrushchev was overthrown and replaced by Brezhnev. So they hadn't been at it very long. And they built this rocket that was their version of the Saturn V rocket. It was about the same size. Some of the problems they had was that they did not have these large rocket engines that von Braun had developed and used in the Saturn V. So whereas the Saturn V had 5 rocket engines at its base in its first stage, the N-1 rocket, the Russian rocket, had 30 engines. So it was incredibly complex that all of those engines had to fire simultaneously and run perfectly. So it was a complex thing. And then they also basically mimicked exactly what the method that the Americans were going to do with a lunar module, and that would have 2 parts. One would stay on the moon and one would go off and return to the mothership. They were going to have just one cosmonaut, but they also had problems with the weight. They weren't able to get the weight down of the lunar module enough. So they were just plagued with problems. And about 2 weeks before the launch of Apollo 11, the N-1 blew up spectacularly on the launch pad, and that was really their last chance to beat the Americans. But there's a fascinating story that happens. Their Hail Mary pass to beat America, which has been largely forgotten, that we have both in both the book and the film that I can tell you about.
We love a unknown story on Cold War Conversations.
Okay. So one of the most amazing things I really had completely forgotten and did not know about when I was going into this project, but that emerged from watching just hours and hours and hours and hours and hours of raw original live television broadcasts, was that a day before the launch of Apollo 11, the Soviet Union, in a last-ditch effort to beat the Americans, launched a robotic spacecraft called Luna 15 towards the moon. And this was announced all over the world, and everybody knew what they were going to do. And their plan was they were going to fly to the moon, land on the surface of the moon, scoop up with their robots, scoop up some lunar soil, and return to the Earth before Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and Mike Collins could get back with the lunar soil that they had gathered by actually landing humans on the moon. And this was part of the drama that we all witnessed. Anybody who was watching television at that time was, what the hell is Luna 15 doing? Where is it? There were concerns that it might run into, there might be some sort of a collision, how infinitesimal the chances of that. And there was conversations back and forth on the hotline to Moscow about this, about what their trajectory was. And all the way to the moon. And during the landing on the moon, there was speculation about what the Luna 15 was doing. About an hour after Armstrong and Aldrin touched down on the moon, it was announced in the world media all over the world that Luna 15 had passed over the lunar module and had landed safely 200 miles away and was busy scooping up soil. And this was really a big part of what had us all riveted. I remember I was alive, I was 10 years old, but I completely forgotten that. Armstrong and Aldrin do their business on the moon, broadcast all over the world. They leave, fly up, join up back up with the lunar module, and suddenly it is announced, actually it was Jodrell Bank in Britain that was monitoring the Luna 15. They announced to the world that, in fact, they've looked at their telemetry and calculations from the Soviet craft, and it had crashed. They had crash landed at 300 miles an hour into the surface of the moon, and that the earlier report that it landed safely was erroneous. So, because it didn't happen, it's been lost to history. But it was a major component of the hour by hour drama that had us all riveted during Apollo 11.
Wow. Yeah, I mean, I was too young really to comprehend what was happening. I vaguely remember being woken up and watching it on TV. But the Soviets launched a number of lunar automated craft, didn't they, to survey the moon?
Well, they were quite successful. The Luna 16, actually, which is the follow-on one, did succeed in doing exactly what Luna 15 failed to do. So they were quite successful and with their robotic spacecraft, but that particular one failed. I mean, it was just an interesting sort of man versus machine drama that got played out.
Yeah, but, that's a great story. Thank you for sharing that. I think the other one, or one of the many fascinating stories I'm finding here is about Poppy Northcott, which some people may be familiar with her, but if you can just explain a little bit about her story.
Well, Poppy Northcott was a graduate from college, the University of Texas. Her first job was working as a computerist, is the name of the job position. And it was working in Houston at the Manned Spacecraft Center. But she quickly found out that she was overqualified for what she was doing. And so they moved her up, and she started working as a computer programmer on return to Earth trajectory for the Apollo program. And she was 25 years old and was brought in to work in mission control during the Apollo 8 mission. And in fact, one of the interesting things about the whole of Mission Control is the average age was under 30 of all of the flight controllers. But she was 25. She was the first woman to work there, and she became a media sensation for about 15 minutes. One of those Andy Warhol 15 minutes of fame things, where she was appearing on television newscasts. And we tracked her down and talked to her and got her to tell her story. I mean, one of the interesting stories about this is that she was actually used in a trade advertisement because she was employed by TRW, an aerospace firm, which then she was working for NASA as a contracted employee for TRW, and she was the first employee of TRW to be featured in trade advertising in magazines. Essentially, they were using her as a symbol of their aerospace team. And she found out. She essentially concluded that she couldn't be fired. She was an image of the company, so that she could speak out on things that she believed in, which were equal pay for women.
Brilliant. And so
she became quite radicalized, but working in this all-male world. The NASA Mission Control is probably the sort of quintessential macho environment. You can imagine, and she became quite radicalized as a feminist in that environment and in that time period when this was just sort of this issue was really bubbling up to the fore. And she ended up founding the Houston chapter of the National Organization for Women, and ended up becoming a national board member for the organization called NOW, which is very well known here in the United States. And as became she was written up in Life magazine, became quite a well-known figure in the women's movement.
Yeah, no, that's a great story. And as you say, she was working on Apollo 8, which was the first mission to actually fly around the moon, wasn't it?
Yes, she worked on Apollo 8, Apollo 11, Apollo 13. She worked right the way through the Apollo program.
Yeah, and Apollo 8 is the one that's famous for that photo. Is it the Earthrise photo? Earthrise,
yes, which was totally unplanned. I mean, one of the, it's become sort of a cliche, but it's very true and interesting that, NASA's entire focus in the space program was looking out, going to the moon. They planned to go to Mars, send robotic craft out to the outer planets. It was always sort of looking out into space and this sort of outward adventure that humanity would eventually go on into the stars. And but the singular most impressive image that resonated the most here on Earth was this view back of the Earth in the background of the foreground of this lifeless world, and it sparked the environmental movement. Really took that image as its symbol and motivated a lot of people to really start to think very differently about the Earth, the sort of island Earth, the spaceship Earth, as it were. And it's one of the most iconic images of the 20th century.
I think it's interesting that anthropologist Margaret Mead said right after the photograph appeared that she thought that one image justified the entire expense of the space program.
And it's interesting, I don't think it would have resonated had it been taken by a robot. I think the fact that it was taken by a human being is what gives that image its power.
Yeah, it definitely illustrates the fragility of Earth in just as a our environment. So just moving on to Apollo 11, people are probably familiar with some of the audio from the missions and the crackle and the conversation backwards and forwards between mission control and the astronauts. But I just do find that fascinating, the speed they're trying to make these calculations, and when they're coming on to the moon's surface, they get that computer error.
Okay, all flight controllers, go for landing. Retro. Go. Fido. Go. Guidance. Go. Control. Go. Telcom. Go. GNC. Go. Econ. Go. Surgeon. Go. Capcom, we're go for landing.
Eagle, Houston, you're go for landing, over. Roger, understand. Go for landing. 3,000 feet. Copy. Alarm. 1201. 1201.
Roger, 1201 alarm.
Same type, we're go, flight.
Okay, we're go.
We're go, same type, we're go.
Flight Fido right on, real good.
2,000 feet, 2,000 feet, into the ag, 47 degrees.
Roger.
47
How's our
degrees.
margin looking, Bob?
It looks okay. We're about 4.5.
Roger.
Forward. Forward. 40 feet down, 2.5. Picking up some dust. Straight shadow. 4 forward, drift into the right a little.
30 seconds.
Forward, just. Contact light. Okay, engine stop.
We copy you down, Eagle.
Houston, Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed.
It's easy to look back at this and think, because it succeeded so marvelously, to think that that was sort of the inevitable outcome. But it was an incredibly risky mission, and the prospects of it going wrong, like if you can imagine, had Apollo 11 crashed, or had they not been able to get off the surface of the moon, I mean, nobody would ever look at the moon the same way again. So it was incredibly risky, not only just for the astronauts, but for the United States to have embarked on this at all. It's a high risk, high reward. But the risks were very, very real, and they came very close to running out of gas, running out of fuel, and landing. The original landing site turned out to be a boulder field, and they had to fly around for an extra 30 seconds, which was, everything was dialed in to happen like clockwork. So that was unexpected, and they had 17 seconds of fuel left when Armstrong finally touched down on the surface. So it was a very risky thing. Nobody had ever done it. Nobody had ever flown this machine before. Down to and landed on the lunar surface. So it was all completely new, largely untested, untried equipment in that environment. But he pulled it off. Armstrong was a remarkable person. He was the guy you wanted with you in that kind of situation.
Yeah. No, very, very fine margins. And I think the lunar module was being flown by computer for the bulk of the time as well, which was a first in itself.
Well, it wasn't being flown by computer, but they had an onboard computer that was tracking the ground, and also was also tracking the command module in the event that they needed to abort and get back. And it was that overload of tracking both the landing site and the command module simultaneously that caused the computer to get overloaded and produce these errors, which caused a bit of a panic for a while until they realized that they could just reset it and keep going. But Armstrong manually landed the lunar module.
Yeah. Now I've sort of read, where press releases are pre-built in case something happens. Were there pre-written press announcements that were ready should the worst happen and they get left on the moon or crash into the moon?
That's a good question, because I've heard that NASA Public Affairs had a file of what to do, but as far as I know, that's never been seen. What has been seen is the speech that was written by William Safire in the White House for Nixon to give, and the procedures to follow in case there was what was known as in case of a moon disaster was the memo. And that surfaced a few years after. In fact, I think it came out in the 1980s. It was discovered. And it's widely seen on the internet now. But that was only written at the prompting of Frank Borman, the astronaut Frank Borman, who was working in the White House as the NASA liaison. And he said to William Safire, well, you've got to think about procedures in case things don't completely work out. And Safire goes, oh, what are you alluding to? Just, you got to have something ready for the widows. But then he wrote this memo, which was essentially folded up and kept in H.R. Haldeman, the White House Chief of Staff's pocket during the Apollo 11 mission, and was never taken out. But
Yeah, it said things like, they came in peace and they will rest in peace. And, it's quite chilling to read, actually. The other thing we discovered is the Newsweek and the Daily News, and most likely some other major publications, were all ready to go with a disaster headline. Because they knew in the event of a mishap, they'd have to get their papers out very quickly. So the Daily News had a maroon headline, all typeface and ready to go. Newsweek had a similar cover for their magazine, all ready to go. But fortunately, they weren't needed. But the press was fully prepared for some sort of a disaster. They had to be.
Yeah. Wow. And I was interested also to read that there was some discussion about what flag to have on the moon.
It was an act of Congress to put up an American flag, actually. There was a discussion about whether it should be a UN flag, whether it should be American flag. And Nixon wanted them to sing this, play the Star Spangled Banner while they were standing there on the moon saluting the flag, which Frank Borman put a nix to that one. But there's quite a lot of controversy about what they should do and whether there should be humans on the moon or Americans on the moon. They did a bit of both.
Right, and how was the moon landing viewed in other countries, like particularly in Eastern Europe, where the governments there would have seen it as a capitalist success and would want to play it down? But how did the general populations and even the governments of Eastern Europe and the communist countries view the landing?
Well, it's interesting. The Yugoslavia, Tito's Yugoslavia, did show the Apollo 11 mission live on television. It was the first time the Yugoslavians had seen the broadcast coming from the United States. And there were, apparently, from what the reports say, is that the country came to a standstill. No one was working. People were just glued to their television sets. In fact, there's even a Yugoslavian film that was made not long ago about when they were walking on the moon, which was about life in Yugoslavia on that particular during that particular week. In Poland, it was interesting. We heard recently from a woman who was American child visiting Poland that summer, and she had a story that secretly the Poles took her family aside and had parties for them with special drinks, which were, I guess, bootleg Coca-Cola cans. But that they were delighted that the Americans had achieved the moon landing, but they couldn't show it overtly in public. But they were set behind closed doors. They were all cheering.
So and what about the Soviet Union? Did Nixon get a message of congratulations from them or not?
Well, it wasn't shown.
Robert, yeah, go ahead with the Pravda.
Yeah, it wasn't shown in Russia. It wasn't shown in China. Pravda had an announcement that they'd landed on the moon on the bottom of page 6. Yeah, so there's a little sour grapes there for sure.
Yeah. So I guess there wasn't a message of congratulations there on that basis. And how do you think the moon landing affected the world generally? Because it is such an iconic event, but what did it change? Many things.
Well, if I could tell one story about the television coverage around the world that did change, is one country where it was not seen was South Africa. And the reason for that was South African country did not have a television network at that time because the government believed that television would pollute the general public. They were afraid of things like pro-communist people speaking on the air or people talking about race mixing. Television was seen as the devil's invention. And so some rich South Africans from Cape Town actually chartered a flight to go to England to see the actual live broadcast at the Hotel Dorchester. So it was a moon. It was their own moon mission to England. But the films of the broadcast were shown at the Cape Town Observatory in Jonestown, I think the next week, and there were segregated audiences were allowed in to see the actual broadcast a week later. And this entire experience, they felt like they were the only ones in the world who didn't see it, eventually caused the South African nation to join the rest of the televised world. And so they had their first network was established in 1976, but the Apollo 11 incident was one of the major reasons why South Africa finally did get television.
Right. That's a good story. And I'm always fascinated by, the sort of the lunar or the Apollo programs or the lunar landings fade away. I mean, there's that line in the film Apollo 13, where, they're going to do the live TV link and no one's actually watching it because it's old news. It's just seen as ordinary.
Well, that's the unique thing about Apollo 11 is that it was the first time that we'd done this. It was the first time that human beings had gone and landed on an alien world. And that was revelatory. The fact that it was broadcast around the world live, the global satellite link up to allow a global broadcast had only come online a couple of weeks before Apollo 11. And so it was a revelatory moment. The entire world had been living in anticipation of this happening for the better part of a decade. And there was a sense of unity around the world. We all felt our common humanity, and a sense that we had somehow collectively done this together. It's the one and only time, perhaps in all of human history, that the entire world had felt a sense of brotherhood and unity. And it's not something that can be easily repeated. Going to the moon again is not going to be like the first time or the third time or the fourth time or the second. It's the first time you do something. The first time you climb Mount Everest is an achievement. The second time you climb Mount Everest is just the second time. So I think even going to Mars would not resonate the same way that first landing on the moon would, for a couple of reasons. First, Mars doesn't hang in the night sky and give us the sense of awe and wonder the way the moon does. And secondly, it's still, even landing on Mars, as spectacular as that would be, it wouldn't be the first time that humans have set foot on another world. So I think this was a unique moment in history that never happened before and will never happen quite the same way again.
In the research that you did, I mean, we've covered some sort of amazing stories that you found, but are there any others that you've just thought, wow, I never knew that, or that is just really, really interesting? If I had to take one answer from each of you.
Go ahead, Al.
Oh God, there's so many. I'm trying to figure out which ones to do. Well, the one thing that I'm sort of amazed by is you may have heard of Project A-119, which was the Air Force's plan to explode a nuclear weapon on the moon. And that came out in public around the year 2000. But what I found was interesting is that plan goes back to the weekend of Sputnik. And when Sputnik went up, there was a conference in Barcelona, Spain. And there was a paper delivered the day after Sputnik was announced, which was a scientific proposal to explode nuclear weapons on the moon as a form of a Cold War competition The author of the paper said it was putting the hand of man on nature, and suggested that the Soviet Union and the United States could engage in a competition to see who could make the bigger crater, and that they could name them after presidents and premiers. And that one was a bizarre one to me, and that was totally lost as far as I could find in history. And that is what led to the plan of the A119, which was the Air Force's crazy proposal to explode nuclear weapons on the moon the following year. So,
wow. So thanks for sharing that one, Alan. And Robert?
Well, there's so many surprises along the way. I think one of the biggest surprises for us is in a story that's been picked over so many times in the last 50 years, how many new things we were able to find. But I think our whole perception or misperception of what was happening in the Soviet Union is one of the most fascinating things to me. The fact that after Sputnik, the American public was just in a panic and digging fallout shelters and imagining that thousands of Soviet rockets were going to rain ruin on the United States at any moment. Well, it turned out the Soviet Union only had like 3 rockets. The whole thing was a bluff. And then when we started the race to the moon, and the American public was riveted to this drama of astronauts going into space, and the cosmonauts were going into space, and one mission after another, and who was going to get to the moon first. Well, it turned out that the Russians had no plans to go to the moon at all. They were just pulling off space spectaculars for propaganda value. There was no coordinated thought about, we're gonna one mission's gonna build upon another to build this level of skills and technological development, which will get us to the moon, which is what the Americans were doing. The Russians were like, oh, let's send a woman into space. Oh, we've got this little capsule. Let's send 3 people into space, and we'll do it because we'll stuff them in the space capsule without spacesuits. That'll save space. Horribly dangerous, but we'll do that because that'll be cool. That'll get headlines, But there was no rhyme or reason why they were doing any of this. It was, let's do a spacewalk. And we didn't know that. We thought they were, on this forward march and were going to beat us to the moon, which was why the American public and congressional leaders were so supportive and allocating funds for this. But it turned out that there was no plan to go to the moon until really late 64, early 65, at which point we were so far ahead. The Russians just were scrambling and really never had a hope in hell of beating the United States. But we didn't, none of that was revealed, and the details of what the Soviet lunar program was actually doing wasn't even revealed until the collapse of the Soviet Union in the early 90s. And that information came out, and we saw what their plans were and how desperately behind they were.
Yeah.
But that was a real surprise.
No, that's really interesting, and appreciate you sharing that. Now, with my guests, I sometimes ask a last couple of questions which aren't necessarily related to the subjects we've been discussing. What I like to ask is, if you had unlimited budget for a drama film based in the Cold War, it can be space related, but you've got an unlimited budget to cover a particular subject.
If I had an unlimited budget, I would spend an unlimited amount of money buying the options to this great book called Chasing the Moon and turn it into a drama. That's what I would do. How about you, Alan?
Great answer. Great answer. I walked straight into that one, didn't I?
Well, I do think that there are a lot of small, interesting stories. For instance, there probably could be a drama just set in Africa about how that they saw the American space program. When we were talking about Ed Dwight, I find it fascinating that you could have a drama about what it was like when NASA had tracking stations in Nigeria and Zanzibar during the Mercury program, and then revolutions broke out in those countries, and the tracking stations were in danger of getting burned down. And so what they were, the USIA and the CIA were giving out photographs of the black astronaut candidate Ed Dwight and telling them, no, don't you see there's a black guy up there.
Thank you, Alan, for that. Last question is, if you could have a beer, a coffee with 3 people from the Cold War period, living or dead, who would you have in that group?
I can answer that one pretty easily, even from the book. The 2 people I would love to talk to are James Webb, the head of NASA, and Julian Scheer, the head of NASA Public Relations. Both of those men I would love to talk to. And that I did as much as I could in the book to bring them alive, but that was an impossibility.
And what questions would you ask them?
Oh my goodness! I mean, a lot of it is like what exactly was going through their mind when they were making certain decisions. How serious did they think that this was going to come off? What were their political concerns? No, there's a lot that those 2 figures to me are fascinating, and I have more than enough questions for them.
Right. Okay. And Robert, who would your 3 be?
I think Nikita Khrushchev would be one, although I came close by interviewing his son. But I think, even though it would probably be a one-way conversation, because I don't think he was a good listener, it'd be very interesting to talk to Nikita Khrushchev, particularly about the idea of doing a joint lunar mission with the United States. So that would be one. Wernher von Braun. I would, if I had been able to interview Wernher von Braun for the movie, I think that would have been incredible. I'd love to probe into his psyche and experiences. He's one of the most fascinating people of the 20th century to me. One of the most complex characters, going from being a colonel in Hitler's SS to the most celebrated scientist of his day, and really being the pivotal figure in putting a man on the moon. So that would be 2. 3, John F. Kennedy. I'd love to go have a drink with John F. Kennedy. That would be great too. I could stay up all night talking to him.
That's a very good trio. Yeah. So thank you for that. So the book is called Chasing the Moon. It's available now, I believe.
Yes, it is.
And the movie is the same title, Chasing the Moon, which I think has been sold to a number of TV networks around the world. So should be available in July in various locations.
It'll be on BBC. Yes, BBC 4 in July. I don't have the exact date, but it'll be on BBC 4 in July, over 3 nights.
Fantastic. That's unmissable, as this podcast will be as well.
Great. Well, thank you so much for having us.
Yes, thank you.
So, do you want some more? There's loads more content, including videos, audio, and links to the book and documentary in the show notes, which are at coldwarconversations.com/episode and the number 72. Don't forget, you can support us and get a Cold War Conversations coaster at patreon.com/coldwarpod. That's patreon.com/coldwarpod. If you like what you're hearing in the podcast, you can really help us by leaving reviews on iTunes, Stitcher, our Facebook page, or where you found this podcast. This really helps raise our profile and get new guests on the show. If you didn't like the podcast, please don't bother. If you can't wait for the next episode, do visit our Facebook discussion group where our guests and listeners, just like yourselves, carry on the Cold War conversation. Just search for us on Facebook. We're also on Twitter at Cold War Pod and Instagram at Cold War Conversations. Thank you very much for listening. It is really appreciated. Goodbye.
boy, look at those pictures. Wow. It's a little shadowy, but he said he expected that in the shadow of the lunar module. Armstrong is on the moon. Neil Armstrong, 38-year-old American, standing on the surface of the moon on this July 20th, 1969.
That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
I think that was Neil's quote. I didn't understand it.
No, one small step for man, but I didn't get the second phrase.